Wayne Dyer said, if you change the way you look at things, the things you will look at change. And my guest today has a beautiful way of looking at the world that I'm hoping will make that quote come to life. I'm with Frank LaRue Owen. And Frank is an award-winning poet, author, hill walker, gardener, and so much more that I hope we're going to uncover in our time here today. So welcome, Frank. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Laura.
Sure. So I would love for the audience to get to know you through your own words. You have such beautiful words. And I've read 4 of your books and love the way that you see the world. In Cosmology, you wrote, "There is a great story that binds us all together, and it's not the one any of us grew up with." Care to illuminate how you see the great story that binds us all together?
Great question. This is really a poem that came out of a time in my life when I realized that so much of my life had been involved with absorbing knowledge from other cultures and traditions. But then there was a kind of bend in the road, so to speak, where I began to really sit with what is most true for me rather than taking on the grafting of somebody else's story. And so it's a poem that came out of some experiences in nature, which is typically where stuff stirs for me. And it really had to do, I think, with stepping through that doorway that we've talked about before around animism and the sense of the story under the story, the world under the world, that which is perceived through what I sometimes call the soft attention, rather than adopting a label or putting something on ourselves and dropping into that state of consciousness in the forest. There was a kind of peeling away of a lot of that. And so it was just the pure perception of humans being on the planet, and almost like if you were to see a tablecloth on a table and then you roll the tablecloth up and there's that foundation underneath. And so that is where that poem Cosmology really came from, which was the unified binding that connects us all.
You mentioned the school of self-attention, and in that you wrote, "There's a form of nourishment that only you can give to yourself, and if you don't learn the language of how that's done, even on your last day here, you will have remained a stranger to yourself and all those with whom you kept company." And that sounds very Walden Pondish to me.
Mm.
Do you think that the point of being here is to discover yourself, or that's how I interpret that quote?
Yeah, I think there's a quality there coming through that poem that has to do with, well, some of it's self-care, some of it's self-love, things we're not taught to do, or very few of us have been. But also, I think coming into a deeper recognition of what I sometimes refer to as the inner mystery school of the soul. So being in right standing with oneself, being at home in one's own skin, which of course is the work of the ages. But there's a way there where, like, if we haven't, another term that I actually absorbed from my late teacher, which was self-befriendment. There's a way there that if we haven't actually done that, then we can't actually serve others. We can't actually be a friend to others.
Yeah.
So that's where I think a lot of that stirred from, was this sense of how can we make the path one where we are cultivating a sense of that self-befriendment, being in right standing with one's own soul, and then from there, being able to serve.
In Celtic Way of Seeing, you wrote, "The inner teachings of the East ask us to become good householders in the Buddhist sense, tenders of space and the people who visit that space, rather than always seeing how we can get, or extract what we want from life. We begin to ask a new question: how can I become the offering? I'm huge on hospitality, reciprocity, being a good steward of whatever space you're in. So how can I become the offering?" For me, is a really good guide for keeping that in the forefront of my mind. It's kind of a good way to encapsulate all of that. So for someone listening who has no idea what that might look like, or maybe even no idea what that means, could you share how a person might become the offering?
Yeah. So, and that's a nice segue from that previous point around self-befriendment, self-care, self-nourishment, in a sense, a self-hospitality, and then extending that to others. And so in the Celtic way of seeing and some other things that I've written, I've explored the concept of the hearth that shows up in Celtic tradition, but I think it's universal. I've spent a lot of time with different indigenous people, different cultures, and that sense of hearth is woven throughout every one of those experiences. Whether that hearth was literally in a home up on a reservation in the northern plains, or whether that sense of hearth was around a Mesoamerican altar out of the Central or South American traditions, that sense of hearth is there. And then really where those explorations got going for me was reflecting on how that is I hesitate these days to use the term Celtic because of some issues that are going on with that term now that weren't going on when I first wrote those books. But perhaps a way of thinking of it would be the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Cornish, all of these different cultures and traditions, that sense of hospitality being completely inseparable from the sense of culture. You know, there's the old saying, never turn someone away from your front door, for it may be an angel who is visiting, that kind of. And then there was also in those writings taking an inspiration from my own family. For instance, my mother's mother, there was that quality of hospitality, and it extended not just from the hearth fire, but to the kitchen. You know, it was this inseparable sense there of feeding people literally, but then there's also the feeding people in other ways that are nourishing and enriching. And so that community sense. So going back to your original question, for somebody that may not know that, have not grown up with that, I think it's a combination of thinking not only of presence of self as offering, but also place. I think of my mother's home where people will walk in, they'll sit down, and if they've never been there before, invariably they start to make comments like it feels warm and cozy and accepting here, you know. So it's that sense of kind of like, how does one's literal living place radiate those qualities? I think of the late Chogyam Trungpa, who said that a person can be born in a home with a dirt floor and still radiate a sense of elegance and hospitality.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's real easy to tell when somebody comes with that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Temple of Warm Harmony, which we read last month in the book club in Fantasia in our private group, so anybody can join that. If you want to do cool things with cool people, go to the website and click on sign me up, and you can meet cool people like Frank, because he was our special guest last month.
Mm.
So anyway, in Temple of Warm Harmony, you wrote, and this is so lovely, I used to keep a strong scaffolding in place. It separated Pure Land from Zen, Zen from Tao, Dharma, quarantined from the way of mountain spirits. With a sudden glance in the middle of a storm, the bottom dropped out, the scaffolding fell, along with my mind, and all these nectars poured into the same vat. Love that last line. That's just really amazing. It's visual, it's sensual, it's powerful. And I really have to know, how does a person take a life experience or a feeling and find the right words to express it so that the idea and the sensation can be shared over and over again? Because I think it's an incredible accomplishment, because it's whole and the words come from the intellect, but it's also married with the feeling, which is the feminine side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was from an experience where I was hill walking with my late teacher, and I had spent, again, this idea of absorbing. I'd spent many years studying both experientially with different cultures and people, but also academically in graduate school, Jungian psychology, transpersonal psychology. And I had a keen interest really since I was around 12, 13, where I cracked open a book on the religions of the world or something and read all of these different chapters, such as on Japanese Shinto. And I was convinced at that moment, I am Shinto, and then I would read the one on Confucianism, and I said, well, that makes a lot of sense to me too, Taoism and so forth. That particular poem comes out of an experience where we were up in the hills outside of Santa Fe, in the Pecos Wilderness area, and a storm was rolling by. It wasn't rolling over us, it was rolling by so that you could observe it. And there was just this very profound effect that that particular storm had. And there was a coalescing. It felt like an integrative moment where all of the labels fell away. And it has stayed with me because I resist labels even to this day. People will say, well, what is it that is your path? And the most that I can say these days is that I'm a wayfarer, but I sidestep using any labels that sort of corner me or put me in a corral. And then with regard to the poem itself, I think your point is very well taken in the sense that it wasn't an intellectual experience, it was a feeling, it was a settling into myself, and a kind of honoring, a recognition that different paths, different teachings, different ideas, from brushing sleeves with all of that was very formative and helpful, and even from the standpoint of learning about something so that you realize that which you are not, that kind of thing. It's this visiting different realms, visiting different worlds in a way. And then with that experience, coming to a place of realizing what is the platform I stand upon? What is the belief that I have? What is the felt sense? What is the presence from within my own path rather than taking on someone else's? And I still love to read about other traditions. I mean, I love to read about some of the work of Joseph Campbell and some of the Jungians like Barbara Hanna and so forth, because there's a kind of comparative mind in some of that writing. And so you learn about something from another tradition that mirrors this from another tradition. And I still enjoy reading about those things. But I think that poem, there was a kind of burning off too. It was a very purifying experience where I was no longer trying to carry something else that wasn't mine. And so it was freeing, it was liberating.
Yeah, I think poetry, art, music are vital because they connect us to the ineffable, and give expression to spirit. Yeah. So what inspires you to write?
I've thought a lot about this because it's changed over time. 25 years ago now, when I first started writing, and I felt like I had some kind of mandate that I was working with. And if I had to put it in a certain way, I feel like some of that writing was my attempt to facilitate my own, but potentially other people experiencing a sense of cultural soul retrieval. And it was imperfect. It was choppy. It was, I was in my mid to late 20s. There was a lot that I didn't know at the time. So being kind of a spiritual greenhorn, but also not being a Celtic scholar. There was a way, like even now, because it's been years since I read all that, but I went back recently and I read a section, and I was delighted to sort of go, okay, yeah, I see where I was going there. And there was some kind of appreciation for my process at that time, which kind of felt like stumbling in the dark, trying to find some living link, some tether back to the ancient ways. And there's a kind of a heartbreaking nostalgia mixed into that too, because I look back with what I know now, which is many years of travel over there and deep dives of exploration into my own genealogy and learning more and more about that and what has been lost. There's a painful quality to some of that. At the same time, there's a sense of congruity to embrace that loss of culture, of tradition, but at the same time, to recognize we're humans on the earth now that have the capacity to have a deep, numinous relationship with nature, and it may not be identical to our ancestors who lived perhaps in a village setting, but there is still a way to drink from that well. And I think that's a lot of what those writings were about. And so I feel like my mandate at that time was a sense of cultural soul retrieval, trying to find that. Since then, I feel like my writing is more mood driven. It's motivated by sometimes it's experiences in nature, sometimes it's encounters with content that arises from the dream, from dream time, from literally my life as a dreamer. Other aspects I think have to do with, I remember William Irwin Thompson, I believe it was, who in a book called Coming to Our Senses talked about how the role of the creative in many ways is a kind of stepping down certain larger energies. And so that's something I sit with a lot, which is I plug into something that's much larger than myself, and then I try to figure out a way to bring that down in a more digestible, relatable form.
Can totally relate to that. Yep.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So in the Cradle of Sunlight, you wrote, "My deepest wish for you is that the deepest part of you can one day put down the battle and let yourself truly be held in a cradle of loving sunlight."
Mm.
And I think that anyone who is on the other side of the battle
Yes.
feels that way for those who are still in the fight.
Right. Right.
So can you share a little of the story behind that sentiment or that discovery for you?
Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah, I guess the way I would put it is this. So much of my life, I grew up in the Deep South, and I grew up in a family that was deeply rooted to the church and Southern culture. And some of that has its positive, but there are also shadow elements that I would attach to all of those things, to institutions, to cultural traditions. And the battle for me was, to use Jungian terminology, I guess would be the best way to do that, is that my own process of individuation increasingly was one that was getting sideways with my religious upbringing and my culture of origin in many ways. That felt like a battle sometimes, especially to my younger self, and trying to find my way and trying to find my place and all of that. Then, per the model of the Jungian idea of individuation, we go through a process which, I kind of view as spiritual initiation in a sense, that's rather than from the outside, it's being initiated by our own soul, and it leads us through different experiences that expand us, that stretch us. And again, I think going back to that sensibility of feeling at home in one's own skin, or having, settling into your own bones of, hey, this is love it or leave it, this is who I am. That battle gets put down, as you say. It's no longer a battle because, you know you have found your own sovereignty in a sense. Now the outside world keeps shifting and changing its ideas of what sovereignty is, and being in one's own individual sovereignty in a world that seems a little bit mad to me right now, that is a psycho-spiritual challenge, and it may actually be the psycho-spiritual challenge of our time, is how to be rooted in our deeper, true knowing in the midst of all that. So it may be that we're all getting tumped into a larger battle. I don't know, but on the level of the individual journey, um, yeah, that's what comes up about that, is this sense of, when you're at home with your own soul, it almost doesn't matter what the externals are.
Yeah. So I know that some paths in life can only be walked alone. So we born alone, die alone. But others are better with company or with a mentor or a guide. And who has been your most significant mentors or inspirations?
Well, first I would say my parents. They I really have to give them a lot of credit because they were deeply embedded in a religious tradition. They're still with me, and they are retired United Methodist ministers. From a spiritual but also a social point of view, I would put them as being of that social activist, liberal minded bent within the Christian tradition. So I didn't grow up with like fire and brimstone, heavy handed versions of a wrathful God or any of that stuff. So, real happy about that. But there was also a deep allowance for me to find my own way, even if that meant it took me out of their tradition and into other traditions. And they may not have always understood what I was doing, but they were always supportive. And they always trusted that there was some deeper process going on that was going to lead me somewhere. And so that was an ever present conversation with my parents growing up and into adulthood and beyond. Um, I've also referenced my late teacher a few times. Darian Grayson was her name. And my path crossing with her came at a time where I had developed a serious allergic reaction to gurus. I had seen enough abuse and heard enough stories of friends of mine who had experienced their own forms of abuse at the hands of quote unquote teachers, and this is across different traditions and different cultures. But I had arrived at this place of I'm done with teachers. And so, as the universe had in store for me, it was the great lesson of, okay, well, now that you're done with teachers, meet your teacher. It was one of these things. And she was not someone who was widely known in the public eye. I mean, she wrote some things and so forth, but she was very private, more of a hermit type figure. Uh, 20 plus years my senior. And like me, she had studied all sorts of different traditions, very aligned with Tao, Zen meditation as a practice in nature. She wrote some about eco psychology, was influenced by Jungian psychology, and then she was also of lowland Scottish descent, and so she had a little bit of what I half jokingly call a Druish, not Jewish, Druish side to her. And so all of those aspects were kind of an amalgamation in her being that served as a kind of, rather than a missionary, more of a permissionary quality for me to say yes to what calls me.
Okay. And you do a type of mentorship called
Mm-hmm.
soul faring. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. My background academically is I have a master's in transpersonal counseling psychology. And in that program, we could specialize in different things. And my focus really was Jungian psychology, eco psychology, with an deep interest in dreams, but also what Arnold Mendel calls the dream body, which essentially is 4/7 lucid dreaming that's always going on. It's that deeper aspect of ourselves that even when we're on an egoic level aren't paying attention, there's something in us that's paying attention. And he called that the dream body. And so one of his core ideas is that, you wake up in the morning and you go through your day, you may receive synchronicities from the world, you may have moods that come over you that you don't quite know why is this happening. Images may even appear to you from within. All of that is the dream body. So that dream body quality, nature oriented spirituality, and then basic psychology was what I focused on in graduate school. Since then, and I used to do traditional psychotherapy back in the late 90s, But at a certain point, I realized my gift is really accompanying, and my image for this is a lantern carrier. It's a person who walks with other people who are undergoing their own apprenticeship to the mystery school of the soul. And that arrives in different ways for different people. It may be a calling, it may be something that they're answering, it might be more of a creative venture, such as the creative path calling to them and them trying to figure out, well, how do I join up with this? How do I live in a way that's congruent to that? Other people, it may arrive as what Stan Groff called a spiritual emergency. It's the sense of what I think of as sort of the cosmic rug pull, where things happen, we're tumbling through change that we don't necessarily understand. And so, how to make sense of the change, how to find one's bearings, what the Jungian psychologist James Hollis sometimes refers to as the middle passage of midlife, where we're transitioning from the first half of life to the second half of life, and the different developmental tasks that we have. Our developmental tasks are very different the first half of life. We're trying to get established, jump through the hoops of education. Some of us get married, some of us have kids, some of us. And then there's this middle passage where everything that we've invested in and built up, including perhaps even an identity, suddenly melts away and we don't have a sense of our bearing. So I work with people from a variety of different backgrounds, would-be poets, would-be writers, and people who are trying to find their own way of riding that horse, so to speak. Others who are involved in a deep process of spiritual discernment about what they believe, perhaps even a process of faithlessness that has overcome their life. Some of the people I work with are chaplains and chaplains-in-training, psychotherapists. Other people, I would say, are in a process of life path transformation and trying to make sense of that terrain.
So, assuming that you have done something similar and probably continue to, what have you gained from your own work in this area, or what might people come out of it? Like we're working with somebody like you. What's at the end of that?
Mm-hmm. Good question. Yeah, I think first and foremost, it would be coming into a greater understanding of one's own wisdom source is one aspect of that. One of the ways that that can express itself is our dream life, where, in some ways, that is simply a process that, capital P, that is unfolding and unfurling. And there's a way in which the psyche continues to nudge us, I think, to try to come into greater consciousness, to come into greater wholeness, to come to understand that in many ways the soul is an autonomous entity that we are in conversation with. So it's learning, but it isn't the same for every person. So there's a way in which one of the reasons I love working with people, and one of the reasons I have loved working with some of the mentors that I've worked with, is there's this ongoing process of learning a fluency in a language that is unique to each person. And so I learn just as much from the people whom I work with as my own process of learning from a mentor. This may sound cliche, but it really is like watching a lotus slowly blooming as the person comes into greater understanding of their own wisdom source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When people ask me why I do what I do, the answer has always been the same. And it's, I really love being there when the light comes on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well put. Yeah.
So what projects do you have coming up?
Well, it's interesting. You find me at a real segue in my life. I kind of feel like I keep coming back to horses today. I'm not sure why, but I feel like I'm on a horse about to change horses midstream. And part of that, quite by design, for the past 5 or so years, I've been very internal. I've been very quiet. I've been doing a lot of my own deeper spelunking, so to speak. And some of that has involved spiritual discernment. Some of that has involved my own creative process. And, for example, the 3 books of poetry that we've talked about, this is with a particular publishing company, and they've undergone a lot of change. And so there's a whole rebranding that they've been undergoing. And as much, I love those people. I know them personally, but I decided to kind of go my own way. And those 3 books are being rolled off of being in print. And so one of the things I'm looking at doing is kind of a new and selected, a collection of poetry that will include some of what I consider to be the best poems from these 3 books, pulled out into a new volume, along with everything that I've written in the past 5 years. So I'm working on that. I'm dreaming on that. I'm in conversation with some folks about that. And then there is this other project that I'm involved with, which I thought with 100% assurance that it was going to be a certain thing 3 years ago. And then some things happened and I realized, okay, I'm kind of back to the drawing board on that, because this whole other wing of information I feel needs to be brought in. So it's an exploration of what I call wayfaring, and it's not tethered to any one culture. In other words, I might bring in some things from the old Japanese master Matsuo Basho, but then I may bring in some things that are drawing on my own Scottish roots, for example, as it relates to poetry and nature and animistic practice. But the offering is one where I want to encourage people to essentially be their own tradition, be their own approach to the contemplative, to the natural, and to the creative. And so that's what's currently stirring in my cauldron.
Cool. No, I get that. I think it has to be unique to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I was hoping you were saying something about dreaming, because I was looking forward to that. But so how can people get in touch with you?
So my website is soulfaring.org, and my email is the same, soulfaring@gmail.com.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for spending some time with us, Frank. And thanks everybody for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that you can share this wonderful and inspiring conversation with others. See y'all next week.
Make sure to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Spotify so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, why not show your love with a review? Thanks. See you next week.